Gun Shalom Akyam, want to give all praise, honor, and glory to Yahawah, Bahasham, Yahawashi, Bahasham, Qadash. Double honors to the elder apostles of great Millstone who teach and rule well, and Shalom to the sincere Akyams burnish truth and sincerity. Shalom. In this video, I want to talk about the global protests, that have been taking place, for a while now, upon the earth. And, this website is a global protest tracker, and it says a one-stop source for following crucial trends in the most significant anti-government protests worldwide since 2017. So this website it basically tracks and covers the anti-government protests that have been taking place since 2017, and I want to show in this video how the protests in general that have been taking place upon the earth, can be linked up with the scriptures of the Bible concerning prophecy. You see, as we can read over here, it says that over 230 significant anti-government protests have erupted worldwide. And it says more than 110 countries have experienced significant protests. 78% of authoritarian or authoritarian leaning countries have faced significant protests. Over 25 significant protests have been directly related to this pandemic. So here we have a map, of the protests that have been taking place. Let me see. Filter all. So these are the countries that have experienced, protests, since 2017, against the government. If we go down the list, we can read Afghanistan, Albania, Algeria, Argentina, Armenia, Australia, Azerbaijan, Bahrain, Bangladesh, and the list goes on and on. Even there's one over here in the Netherlands that they listed, which was concerning these restrictions for this pandemic, which took place in January 2021. And the duration of it was for a month. And for the people that are interested, in this topic, Rawchaa, I'm able to put the link, down below. But as we can see, a lot of protests have been taking place. All these things, link up with scripture. This is from the same website, and it says worldwide protests in 2020, a year in review. So this is going into the year 2020, what happened, and it says, in an extraordinary year, this pandemic did not deter protesters around the world, despite restrictions on protest right and the danger of gathering in groups. So despite that the government put forth certain rules and regulations of not being allowed, to be outside in groups, the people, they didn't regard, whatever the government said. They still went outside. The year 2020 highlighted the resilience of protesters, protests around the globe, despite the greatest public health challenge in over a century, and the viral threat, lockdowns, and increasingly repressive environment is triggered, protests remained an integral part of the global political landscape. So even during this pandemic, these protests continued going on. In early 2020, when little was known about the virus and it seemed like a localized problem, the protest surge that had marked the second half of 2019 continued. Huge demonstrations kept rolling politics in places as diverse as Chile, Hong Kong, and Lebanon, and new, shorter protests like those over the downing of an airliner in Iran, erupted regularly. And a little fun fact: the year 20, selected the year 2019 was being named the year of protests. You see? So the Financial Times, 2019, the year of protest. You see, so a lot, went on in 2019 too. You know, a brief pause, then a surge of protests. However, the rapid globalization of the pandemic in February and March drastically reduced the number and size of protests. Some observers wondered if the global protest wave had met its match. But the lull did not hold. Just a few weeks after lockdowns were widely imposed, protests began to re-emerge. Data from Carnegie's Global Protest Trigger shows that already in April, the number of new protests rose to a high level, approximately one new significant anti-government protest every 4 days. As the chart below shows, the rapid proliferation of new protests continued for the rest of the year. So they see that there's a surge, you know, starting, what did they say, April? So there's a surge in April, which is, even double than the year prior. It's the same for March, and then the peak, is in June, with September 2019 being the highest. But as the scripture also says, these are the significant new anti-government protests in 2019 and 2020, which also means that there are less significant, protests that are not included, in the numbers that are shown on this website. So it says familiar grievances drove protests. Many of these new protests centered around the core issue that have driven the global protest wave of recent years, such as corruption, electoral manipulation, and police brutality. So these are a couple of reasons why these protests took place. Corruption remained a powerful mobilizer in both authoritarian and democratic countries. For example, rampant corruption in Bulgaria has sparked months of demonstrations against the government of Prime Minister Boyko Borisov. In Venezuela, systematic corruption and state capture continue to drive protests against President Nicolas Maduro, which have been occurring intermittently since 2014. Fraud elections or other political transitions were also a key issue in 2020. Frustrations with the sluggish transition to democracy in Sudan fueled a Million Man March movement, which began in mid-2019 and flared up throughout 2020. Meanwhile, in Belarus, the blatant electoral manipulation propping up the decades-old dictatorship of Alexander Lukashenko spurred a massive, sustained sleeper uprising after the country's August election. You see, so as we can read, for multiple reasons, these countries, went to protest against the government. You know, it says another prevalent protest theme of 2020 was citizen anger over police brutality. From the Black Lives Matter protests in the United States to the End SARS protests in Nigeria and protests in France over police security bill, ending police abuse and systematic discrimination. Issues that had been fueled protests in many countries for years became a more transitional cause. See, so like I said earlier, all these nations, all these countries, you know, go to the streets to protest against the government for various reasons. And all these things were prophesied, in the Bible, to take place upon the earth. Impact of the pandemic. The pandemic was a key protest driver in 2020. It created new protest triggers as public health measures became objects of political contestation. whether in the form of anger over lockdowns, economic displacement, or government mismanagement of the public health crisis. Anti-lockdown protests emerged in at least 26 countries, and the perception that political leaders were using restrictions to quash domestic dissent drove protests in Bolivia, Israel, Serbia, and Uganda. Protesters in Brazil condemned President Jair Bolsonaro's failure to adequately respond to the virus, while in Malawi, street vendors complained that the virus-related restrictions would put them out of business. Though a poison is in sight, a reduction in protest levels is not. You see, so this was written in like December 21st, 2020, which is a little over half a year ago. So it says even though the poison is inside, a reduction in protest levels is not. So here they're already expecting that more protests is going to take place upon the earth. Although the acute crisis looks likely to gradually ebb in the year ahead, the widespread economic and social devastation it has wrought, as well as citizens' anger about aggravated economic realities and the legacy of governance failing by many states, will be much slower to fade. Both long-standing and new grievances will continue to inflame public debates, fueling an increase in all confrontational political dynamics, not just protest but also polarization and populism, having shown remarkable resilience as a political strategy, even under potentially dangerous conditions. Surging protests will almost certainly continue to punctuate global politics in the new year and beyond. So there's already an expectation that more is going to take place, which we're going to go into um, a little bit later on. So this is the amount of protests by month, which people can compare for themselves. So one of the latest protests that is taking place, um, is from July 26, 2021, concerning the passport that is, you know, uh, coming out, you know, which is going to be required for the people to basically have a so-called, normal life again. So that's one of the reasons that people go to the streets, because they're against it. Why? Because they're realizing that slowly but surely that their fundamental human rights are taken away. They're not able to go outside, not able to go to the grocery store, they're not able to, you know, go ahead and do the daily business if they don't have this passport. They can't prove themselves to be another so-called threat to society. You see. Um, Another one is from a couple of days ago too, which is going into the same topic, concerning France, Italy, and Greece. Um, you know, basically going into the same thing. Because the people are realizing that slowly but surely their rights are taken away. You know. So this is Second Esdras chapter 9 and verse 1. He answered me then and said, measure thou the time diligently in itself, and when thou seest part of the signs past, which I have told thee before, then shalt thou understand that it is the very same time wherein the Highest will begin to visit the world which he made. And how we measure the time diligently in itself is by watching the news, see what's going on upon the earth, and filter it through the scriptures. And by filtering through the scriptures, we can see that we're in a certain period of time. You know, our Messiah, Yahawashi, who was the savior of the nation of Israel, the so-called Negroes, Latinos, and Native Americans, but also those that are scattered among the heathen nations that might look like the heathen nations. But this lineage does go back to Abram, Isaac, and Jacob according to their father's seed line, is about to come back. You know. Verse 3. Therefore, when there shall be seen earthquakes and uproars of the people in the world, all these protests are uproars. You know. Verse 4. Then shalt thou all understand that the Most High spake of those things from the days that were before thee, even from the beginning. You see, so by reading the scriptures, filtering, what's happening upon the earth through the scriptures, we come to realize like, hey, that these things were already prophesied beforehand, you know, thousands of years ago, you see. And it's all prophesied that these things would come, man. It's all prophesied, it's all in the scriptures, but it's only for those with eyes to see and ears to hear. Because, you know, the understanding is not given to everybody. This is Second Esdras chapter 15 and verse 14. Woe to the world and them that dwell therein. And woe means destruction. So, the world is going to experience destruction. Verse 15, for the sword and their destruction draweth nigh. And that sword represents the modern day weapon, which is the gun, which goes into the wars that are about to come upon the earth. The Third World War, but also the war that the people are going to fight between themselves. Purge-like situations. And it says, for the sword and their destruction draweth nigh, because this society is going to experience a collapse. The way that we know society right now is not going to remain. And eventually, the last destruction that is going to take place is the destruction of America and certain other places upon the earth by these ICBM missiles. You see, it says, and one people shall stand up to fight against another, and swords in their hands. Which goes into these purge-like situations. When society is down, people need to survive. And make sure that they're the one that you know gonna be gonna be surviving. Verse 16. For there shall be sedition among men, and invading one another. They shall not regard their kings nor princes, and the course of their actions shall stand in their power. And the word sedition, if you look that up in the Folex dictionary, it says conduct or language inciting rebellion against the authority of the state, which basically means protesting against the government. You see, and as we go back to verse 16, it also says that they should not regard their kings nor princes, as we could read in the very what is it? Um, very first paragraph over here. It says, in an extraordinary year, this pandemic did not deter protesters around the world, despite restrictions. So the modern-day kings nor princes refer to the government officials, those that have a certain power to enforce the law. You see, and it says, despite restrictions on protest rights and the danger of gathering in groups. So they did not regard the rules and regulations that were put forth by their governments. You see, that's why it says they should not regard their kings nor princes. In the course of their actions shall stand in their power. The people are going to do whatever the heck they want to do. Whether it's so-called peaceful protest, or whether it's going to be violent clashes upon the earth. You see, and eventually these things are going to lead down to martial law, as it says in verse 17. A man shall desire to go into a city and shall not be able. You see, so because of this sedition, because of the chaos that's gonna erupt, by the people not wanting to obey to the government, martial law is going to be established in order to enforce the law. You see, this is Nahum chapter 3 and verse 2. The noise of a whip and the noise of the rattling of the wheels and of the prancing horses and of the jumping chariot. This refers to the vehicles that are going to be used during the martial law. You see the tanks, the trucks, the pickups. Verse 3, the horsemen lift up both the bright sword and the glittering spear. And there is a multitude of slain and a great number of carcasses. And there is none end of their corpses. They stumble upon their corpses. You see, so the horsemen refers to the people that are in the trucks, in the tanks, and basically it refers to the martial law troopers in general. They're going to be armed and dangerous, and if the people are not willing to oblige, um, to whatever is being put forth by the government, these martial law troopers are there to enforce the law, and they're going to have the okay to use deadly force. You see, gonna kill people. You see, that's the time that we're heading into. You know, so you know, small summary concerning this lesson. I spoke about how this website shows us that since 2017 there have been over 230 significant anti-government protests around the world. This links up with biblical prophecy. These things need to take place before the second coming of Yahawashi. You see, who's the Messiah, who's a so-called dark-skinned man, the tribe of Judah. Um, so hey, Lord willing, this lesson was edifying. And I want to give all praise, honor, and glory to Yahawah, Bahasham, Yahawashi, Bahasham, Qadash. Double honors to the elder apostles of Great Millstone who teach and rule well, and shalom to the sincere Archams, furnish truth and sincerity.